Professional learning sessions!
What do you see? What do you notice? Big. So if you have a tree and you ask kids to look at something, to tell you what they notice about it, they often say some kind of superficial things at first. So what we want to puzzle over is how can you get kids to go deeper, make deeper observations. And saying things like, look hard, tends to not be super helpful. But it gets said a lot. So here's the guiding question we'd like you to discuss for just a minute with somebody next to you. So just do what we call a turn and talk. Just go ahead and turn and talk about this question.
Sometimes I think question's not about what it is, but what happened.
Let's share out a little bit. Let's hear some of the ideas that you shared.
I think zooming in and zooming out.
Yeah.
I think so often we teachers, we ask questions that we actually have answers to, and so I think that it's a good idea for us to ask questions that we don't have an answer to.
It's largely about learning how to observe. So what we're going to do, and it kind of feeds off of what you guys just said right now too, is we're going to take a look at making observations in sort of a body way, sensual body way, sensory body way. Did I say sensual? That's another workshop. So we're going to look at things both in a sensory way and also in kind of a brainy way and make sort of comparisons between those. And with that, we are now going to divide into two groups, and we're going to go outside.
Can I be in the sensual group?
We are going to do a little smorgasbord of sensory activities, and some of these might be familiar to you from different things that you've done, different trainings, different activities that are already done with students. We're going to be pulling from folks like Tom Brown, Coyote Mentoring, Steve Van Zandt, Steve Van Mater, John Muir Laws, all those folks. And what I ask that you do during this time is participate fully, and if you've done the activity before, that's great, but really think about what this is like for students. And there's a Mary Oliver quote, "Let me keep my mind on my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished." Close your eyes and listen. For every sound you hear, put up one finger. So take a second, I'll give you a little time to think, and then we'll do another turn and talk. What might students get out of these sorts of activities?
A first step and a first sort of awareness of what's actually going on and building a sense of place.
Yeah, and giving them an opportunity to explore things with tools that they have built in.
Todd Newberry was a really phenomenal marine biology instructor at UC Santa Cruz, and a famous quote of his is, "They drove 150 miles to the intertidal zone, but they wouldn't get down the last 4 feet." They went to the tide pools and they, just standing there, not looking, not getting into those different vantage points. And hand lenses are a really wonderful tool that can invite students into getting into those vantage points in a different way. So we're going to do a little hand lens intro. And when you get the hand lens, what I want you to do is put it around your neck. And please, 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 we don't have sun right now, but if we were to have sun, please don't burn anything with the hand lenses. It's actually dangerous. And we just need to be respectful with these sorts of tools. Hand lenses are really, really neat tools. It's super, super useful to do just a really quick intro on using them with students. Otherwise, they do what they've seen on those detective shows where they walk around like this. I think that they're using their hand lens. It's not quite what they're used for. So take your hand lens and hold it in your hand like this. And so what you're going to do, you're not going to hold the hand lens far away. You're going to put it right up to your eye. It helps to close one eye if you can do that. And then what you want to do is you want to, let's practice with our fingertips. You can put your fingertips out and then move your head really slowly until what you're looking at comes into focus. What you're going to do now is with your hand lens, you're going to do something called body radar by Coyote Mentoring. And what that is basically you just kind of feel what you want to explore. And you don't have to explore with other people. You don't have to explore anything in particular. Take your hand lens out and just start to check stuff out. You could go back to those bushes over there, those trees. You can look at leaves. You can look at the ground. But we're going to take a couple minutes, just float around and look at whatever's interesting you. If you're not interested in what you're looking at, move on to something else. All right, rock and roll. why might it be important to do these sorts of activities with students?
It kind of slows the pace. You can't be in a rush in doing this. You got to kind of slow down and take it in.
There are so many more sensory activities. There's sit spots, there's card hikes, there's so many different ways for students to perceive the world. We're not going to go into those too much more now because they're kind of out there in the world. This next routine called I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of is a technique developed by John Muir Laws, who's our friend Jack, who's here. And it's kind of the backbone of his field experiences and the work that he does teaching people, but also the work that he does as a naturalist and an illustrator. What we're going to start by doing is just think for a second, who are the really excellent observers of the world?
The youngest of us?
The youngest of us.
The kids, babies.
So Sherlock Holmes, as written by Arthur Conan Doyle, says, I see no more than you, but I have trained myself to notice what I see. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to practice observing and practice a few really concrete tools that will help to look at the world in a different way. What I'd like you all to do is to pick up a leaf that looks like this. So the first tool that we have is I notice. Everyone say the words I notice. I notice. So I know I'm making an observation when I begin a sentence with the words I notice. An observation is something I perceive with my senses. It's not something that I know already. So saying I notice it's a leaf, that's not an observation, that's an identification. I notice it's gross, that's my opinion, that's not an observation. So observations are what we perceive through our senses. What you're going to do now is you're going to look at your leaf, and for about 30 seconds, you're going to say out loud as many observations as you can. If you feel like you're stuck, if you're like, I notice, try listening to the folks around you. Try using some of the tools that we just gained of changing your perspective. Look at it through your hand lens. Try seeing what it feels like, what it smells like. Go. Any quick observation anyone wants to share with the group? So the next tool is starting to ask questions. Everyone say the words, I wonder. I wonder. So many observations can lead to questions. I heard someone, they were looking at their leaf and they were like, I noticed that there's a big chunk missing out of it, and I wonder how that happened. So we're going to take another 30 seconds, look at your leaf, make as many I wonder statements as possible. So there's one more tool. It's called It Reminds Me Of. Everyone say It Reminds Me Of. It reminds me of. And this can be something that you know already. It could be a piece of information that you have about leaves or how they fall from trees already. It could be something it looks like. It could look like a comb. It could look like a frog, anything. It could be an experience. Take 30 more seconds. You're going to remind yourself of as many things as possible. And with this, sometimes it can be really useful to just look at one part of the leaf or one part of whatever you're looking at. So instead of looking at the whole thing, just look at the little stem. What does that remind you of? What do the veins remind you of?
Fuzz reminds me of cherry leaves.
So take a second, look at your leaf. Now look at how many leaves are around us. Look at how many things in the world that are not leaves. It's a lot that we found out in a short amount of time just by using these 3 prompts. I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. And there's a lot we can find out in the world by taking those tools and walking through the world with them. In small groups, it could be a group of 2 or 3 or 4, or if you want to fly solo, you can do that too. What you're going to do is spread out in this area and find something to check out using these 3 prompts. I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. I have some tools if you find a cool critter or something like that. I have a cup that you can put it in. You can come find me if you need any of those tools. You have your hand lenses too.
I noticed that looks like it's burst open, right?
Right. Looks as if there's sort of spore-like stuff in there. Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
It's gone through its life cycle. Is this like an insect hole down here?
Right there. Yeah, it sure looks like that's pretty round and spherical, right?
I wonder if that down is from the same bird.
Has the same grayish color.
It totally does. That's really pretty.
I wonder. Oh yeah, and actually the edges of it. Look at, they have that same brownish color on the edges. I wonder the age. Is this a baby bird? Do you think? The feathers are small, but maybe the bird's small, or is the
not so lucky fledgling?
Yeah.
Not so lucky. Right.
You know, you can't move 5 feet without finding something cool.
So we started out looking for soil and ended up finding birds.
Yeah. Then my next step would say, well, how does all this relate to soil?
And these are tools that you can take wherever you are. If you take this with you, you will never be bored again.
It helps them get to the point of asking a good question, right? So it provides a lot of that background without the talking head educator out front to get them to the point to ask good questions.
And I think it's not just good questions, but it's authentic questions that they actually care about. I think so often we get like, oh, well, what do you think about this? And we act like that. Oh, now they're engaged. But they're not unless they actually have a question and they really do want to know. And I think this lends itself to that, so you're getting what they want to know.
We call this a routine. It's not an activity you do once and bam, it's over. This is something that if done well, it's done throughout every field experience. And it can really change every aspect of a field experience by keep on going back to this routine over and over again. It's so simple, but so transformative.
We're trying to help kids to develop the ability to do this without the field instructor, right? We want them to go home and be able to do all this. So the more that the student, the learner, is dependent on the naturalist or the field instructor to guide them, the less capable they're going to be or independent they'll be later. So we're always trying to encourage like the instructors, talk a little less. You know, listen a little more. Let them talk a little more. Let them look a little more.
You set us up, she had done the activities, and all of a sudden it was time for us to have 9 minutes to go at it. Like, I was running down before she was even ready to go. And I feel like you set it up correctly like that, the kids want to go experience it.
So we are surrounded by tons of information out in the world. Anywhere we go, I mean, you're looking at that leaf, right? And then you're looking at all that foliage around you like, oh my God, this is surrounded by so much information. We tune tons of it out. We tune the vast majority of this information out. In the past, when we're out in nature, you know, our ancestors, it's like, you see some motion, is it gonna eat me? Can I eat it? You're really focused and you're really paying attention in those moments. And when you turn that focus on, all kinds of stuff comes out. But we tune the rest of that stuff out. And there's reasons for that, right? You'd be just overwhelmed. But what's kind of cool is with a device like this, a routine like this, you can turn the focus on and you can direct it at whatever you want to focus on at that time. This is like this little internal machine we all have that we do it inadvertently, but here's a way to do it consciously, to say, I'm going to get into this leaf. I'm just going to go for it on this leaf. I've ignored leaves my entire life. Now it's going to be all about this leaf right here. And whoa, that whole leaf world comes out. So now, conceptual frameworks, our brains, when it reminds me of things, you guys have brought up, it reminds me of things. There's real reasons behind doing this activity. One of them, you mentioned this a little bit, it makes kids relate things to their normal life and all that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of research about this and the importance of doing this. And part of it is that when you make connections in your brain, you're actually changing the structure of your brain. You're actually growing dendrites whenever you make connections in your brain. So if you have somebody throws some interesting fact at you and you don't figure out connections, what your prior experiences are, other things in your brain, that little thing that's that disparate little memory or that fact or whatever probably won't be retained. But if you make connections, the more connections you make, the more likely you're going to remember it. And the thing about saying it out loud too, if you say things out loud, that changes the way you remember things as well, because you're dealing with two different parts of your brain there when you have to say it out loud. It activates more parts of your brain. We're all born curious. And when you focus on lots of right answers, that often, you think by delivering answers, you're delivering information and people are learning. But inadvertently, it's killing the curiosity. But if you give them the right tools and the right structure and everything, and then let them go, it can be just amazing. And it's like this natural curiosity that they've had, and they've had to keep this lid on because the school system said to or whatever. You suddenly take that lid off and they're like, I know exactly how to do this.
Now we're going to start talking about what choices we make as instructors and kind of how our teaching philosophy guides us to actually help students make observations. This is the time now when we're going to start to dive into those really juicy conversations. We're going to be talking about the kinds of instructional choices we make to encourage student observations, And we're going to be doing it by talking about anthropomorphism and then naming and identifying. I'm going to pass out a handout right now, and it lays out a spectrum for each of these things, so kind of like 2 different extremes. And in your small table groups, we're going to give you about 15 minutes. What I want you to do is read through the different topics and both of the extremes on either side of the spectrum, and then as a table decide what you want to talk about and to just dive in. Think about where you fall on that spectrum, where your program falls, where you want your instructors to fall on that spectrum, how you can get them there. Really, try and dive into one of the topics as deeply as you can. And if you have time and you feel done with one topic, then move on to the next one. But you're only going to have about 10 or 15 minutes total.
So what I guess I find myself sort of with the feet in both places. I think coyote stories are fun and useful and interesting. And at the same time, when I'm looking at behavior of things, I try to especially to role model in my analysis of what I'm looking at. My thinking about not trying to project a human explanation of what I'm seeing on, or you're saying that, or even sort of the evolutionary storytelling of, this does this to do this.
So it sounds like all of us are pretty much in the middle, depending on the situation and the age of students as well.
Names are really important to humans. We love to name things and group them and categorize them. And sometimes that's where our emotional connection comes from. So I wouldn't want to just withhold a name. And sometimes I will give a name to something in passing if we don't have time to really figure it out. But that student really wants to know what this name is.
Let's start with anthropomorphism.
It can make students start giving human explanations to natural phenomena that are inaccurate. And I didn't even get to this here, but I think occasionally it can discredit us as professionals when you apply human emotions to animals and we're telling people we're teaching kids science.
I looked at it both ways. Of one, sometimes the kids connect more with like, oh, I want to call it Billy, but later in life, if they're not going to read about Billy in the news, they're going to read about like how the great horned owl is endangered. So if you miss that piece, you're losing part of the sense of place, I think. So room for both.
I think anthropomorphism can be used as a useful tool if you're using it as a way to make the kids, because they're relating everything to their own experiences. So if you're going like, you have a home and a house, like what do you think the animals out here are using as a home? Or talking about the forest as a salad bar. So using the students' own experiences for them to then think about the animals and the plants.
It was important that students know the names of what we were looking at, but not that we name it for them. That we kind of facilitate the process of students going through that and figuring out what it is. And Jack was giving a good example that as soon as you give the name, you're done. You're moving on to the next thing. And so if we look at the I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of exercise, that's a perfect, I think anyway, lead into ultimately getting to a name, but it forms that emotional connection. And so kind of started the discussion saying, I really don't care if kids know the names of things. I care that they're emotionally connected to the outdoors and to the environment. And that name sometimes acts as a block, but it could also be a connector later in the process. So I actually wrote this down from Jack. Trailing with the name rather than leading with the name.
Yeah, I think you guys have kind of hit on the main point here, which is that naming and identifying things can be really important, but how you do it really impacts how kids can learn. And so if you just right away say this is what this is, oftentimes it just kind of shuts them down. It's like, oh, I can check that box. Oh, I saw it. But if you give them a chance to explore, to make their own connections, and then to name something, it can be a really useful and memorable experience. We want to sum up this section by just saying, don't be automatic, be thoughtful. And all of these decisions, it's always an it depends. Pretty much the answer to every question about teaching is it depends. And so it's going to depend on your group and where they're from and how comfortable they are and all the great things that you guys have brought up all morning.
So if you're doing all these observation activities like the ones we did outside, we're doing stuff, you're getting into the body, the sensory stuff, and you're doing the brain stuff with the I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of stuff. Hopefully we're going to help kids become more deeply observant. So a question I have for you right now is, what might a deeply observant student look like?
You're touching.
Yeah, they're using all their senses, to see what this is, to observe.
They're present.
The process would be personalized. It's going to look different for each student, but something that is inherent to them, the degree of playfulness or the degree of intensity will be different with different people, and I think that would be a good sign that it's not homogeneous.
They're actually they're finding stuff I can't even see.
When you want to approach the natural world through a scientific perspective, you have to approach with humility. It's being humble. It's not making the assumption that I understand what it's like to be a bunny, or I understand what it's like to be a tree, but it's not projecting yourself onto nature, but it's trying to see nature as it actually is.